The blue light of the laptop screen felt like a scalpel, cutting through the heavy darkness of the hotel room. Outside, Chicago was a blur of rain and distant sirens, but inside, the world had shrunk to the size of a 5-inch security feed. I caught my parents on my security camera planning to move my brother into my house while I was on a trip. I watched, breathless, as my mother smoothed the duvet on my bed with a casual, terrifying intimacy. Then, she turned to my father and spoke the words that shattered the last 20 years of my life. "Once everything is here, she will not make a scene. She will just accept it," Mom said. She actually laughed, a soft, musical sound that felt like a chokehold. So, I sat there in the silence of room 412, and I began to set a trap for them. And I knew, with a cold, hollow certainty, that I was going to enjoy it. For most of my adult life, I had been the invisible pillar of the family. My name is Courtney, and I am the one who remembers birthdays, the one who pays for the emergency dental work, and the one who never asks for anything in return. I am the stable one, the reasonable one. My parents, Silas and Martha, used those words like medals they were pinning to my chest, but I was starting to realize they were actually just weights, designed to keep me from drifting too far from their reach. The hotel room smelled of stale lavender and industrial carpet, a scent that usually grounded me during these high-stakes work trips. I am an architect. I build structures to withstand earthquakes and gale-force winds. I understand load-bearing walls. I understand the precise point where a foundation will crack under too much pressure. My parents had spent decades testing my foundation. And according to my mother's laugh on the monitor, they believed I was indestructible. Or perhaps, they just didn't care if I broke. As long as the roof stayed over my brother Julian's head. I watched the screen as Julian walked into the frame. He was carrying a cardboard box labeled kitchen, and dropped it onto my mahogany dining table with a thud that I could almost feel in my teeth. He looked around my living room, not with the eyes of a guest, but with the hungry gaze of a conqueror. Julian was 32 years old, a professional dreamer who specialized in spending other people's money. To my parents, he was a delicate spark that just needed a little more fuel to catch fire. To me, he was a forest fire that had already burned down everything I tried to plant. I leaned back against the headboard, my fingers hovering over the trackpad. I should have called them. The old Courtney, the one who lived by the lie that silence equaled safety, would have called and begged for an explanation. I would have offered a compromise. I would have asked how I could help Julian find his own place. But as I watched my father point toward my home office and gesture about where to put a new sofa, something in me didn't just crack. It vanished. They were counting on my shame. They were counting on the fact that I would rather lose my home than lose the image of our perfect, functional family. They believed that, because I had never made a scene before, I was incapable of ever making one. They had mistaken my grace for a lack of options. I closed the security app. The room plunged into total darkness, save for the red standby light on the television. My heart was a steady, rhythmic drum in my chest, devoid of the frantic panic I usually felt when family drama erupted. This was different. This was the clarity of a structural failure. I reached for my phone and checked my flight details for the morning. I had 6 hours before I needed to be at the airport. 6 hours to stop being the daughter they expected and start being the woman they deserved. I opened a new spreadsheet on my laptop. I didn't title it. I didn't need to. I began to type in the numbers. $4,000 for Julian's car. $2,000 for his rent in April. $800 for a credit card. Bill he swore was a one-time mistake. As the list grew, the weight on my chest began to lift. I wasn't just counting money. I was counting the seconds, until I could finally let go of the burden of being the good one. I was going to give them exactly what they wanted. I was going to let them move in. I was going to let them get comfortable. And then, I was going to show them exactly what happens when the load-bearing wall finally gives way. The rain continued to lash against the window. But the Chicago skyline no longer looked lonely. It looked like a challenge. I had built a life of stone and steel in Seattle, and I had done it alone. If they wanted to play house in my sanctuary, I would let them. I would let the house fill with their noise and their entitlement until the pressure was perfect. Then, I would pull the pin. I closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to visualize the blueprint of the coming week. By the time I landed in Seattle, the trap would be set. And for the first time in my life, I wouldn't be the one paying the price for the peace. The hum of the Boeing 737 jet engines was a low, vibrating growl that seemed to synchronize with the throbbing in my temples. I sat in seat 4A, staring out at a sea of black clouds punctuated only by the rhythmic strobe of the wingtip lights. In the darkened cabin, the air felt thin and recycled, smelling of burnt coffee and the faint, metallic tang of the ventilation system. My laptop sat heavy on my knees. A digital ledger of a life lived in service to people who viewed my heart as a revolving door. I had spent the last 3 hours of this red-eye flight performing an autopsy on my own generosity. One by one, I opened the digital folders of my past 5 years. I looked at the wire transfers I had labeled as family support. I looked at the Venmo payments for utilities that were never mine to pay. One payment of $300 looked like a kindness. 5 payments looked like a pattern. 50 payments looked like a ransom. I felt a sudden, sharp spike of nausea as I scrolled deep into a sub-folder of my tax documents. There it was. A notification from a credit monitoring service I had ignored 3 months ago during a particularly brutal week at the firm. I had assumed it was a mistake or a solicitation. Now, with the clarity of a woman who had seen her own mother planning an invasion on a security feed, I looked closer. My stomach dropped as I read the details of a lease agreement for a luxury sport utility vehicle. The monthly payment was $942. The name on the primary line was mine, Courtney Miller. But the address listed for the registration was not my house in Seattle. It was my parents' home in Portland. My brother Julian had not just been taking the money I gave him, he had been harvesting my identity to fund a lifestyle that the one actually doing the work, didn't even permit myself to have. The betrayal felt like a physical weight, a cold pressure sitting right on my sternum. I leaned my head back against the thin airplane headrest and closed my eyes. Images of my childhood flashed behind my lids like a faulty film reel. I saw 10-year-old Julian breaking a neighbor's window with a baseball, and my father looking at me, telling me to tell the neighbor I did it, because they liked me better. I saw 20-year-old Julian failing out of his 3rd semester of college, and my mother crying into her tea, telling me that if I didn't tutor him through his retakes, his entire future would be on my conscience. I was the invisible daughter. The one who worked through the night so that others could sleep. The one who built walls so that Julian could tear them down. For years, I had told myself that my silence was a form of strength. I believed that by being the one who never complained, I was proving my worth. I thought that if I was indispensable enough, they would finally see me as a person rather than a resource. But as the plane banked toward the Seattle-Tacoma airport, the lie finally dissolved. Being indispensable had not made me loved, it had made me a target. My parents didn't value my stability. They valued my utility. To them, my success was just a larger pool of water for them to drain. I opened a new document on my laptop and began a different kind of list. This wasn't a list of what I had lost. It was a list of what they were about to lose. I noted the timestamp of the security footage from the hotel. I noted the date of the fraudulent car lease. I began to map out the connections between Julian's supposed ventures and the bank accounts he had manipulated. The woman who had boarded this plane in Chicago was a victim of a quiet, domestic haste. But the woman landing in Seattle was an architect. I knew how to read the blueprints of their greed. I knew where the cracks in their stories were hidden. Julian wanted a content house. He wanted an audience. He wanted the world to see him as a self-made man of luxury. A cold, hard smile touched my lips as the landing gear locked into place with a mechanical thud. I would give him an audience. I would give my parents the scene they were so sure I would never make. They were currently in my living room, probably drinking my wine, and deciding which of my paintings to move to the basement to make room for Julian's ring lights. They thought they were moving into a house. They didn't realize they were moving into a cage of their own making. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. You're turning off the airplane mode. As soon as the wheels hit the tarmac, a flurry of notifications arrived. Another motion alert from the living room. A text from my father, asking if I could stay an extra 2 days in Chicago, because the house felt so peaceful, and he wanted to make sure I wasn't rushing back to work. He wasn't worried about my stress. He was buying time for the movers. I didn't reply. I didn't scream. I gathered my things with the methodical precision of a professional. As I walked down the jet bridge into the cool, damp air of the Pacific Northwest, the fear was gone. In its place was a quiet, vibrating energy. I had spent my life building things for other people. Now, for the first time, I was going to build something entirely for myself. It was time to go home. It was time to meet the guests who had forgotten they weren't invited. The gray dawn over Seattle looked like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. I stepped out of the terminal, the damp air sticking to my skin like a second, colder layer of clothing. I didn't call a car to my front door. Instead, I directed the driver to a street 3 blocks over, a neighborhood of quiet cul-de sacs where my presence would remain a ghost in the morning mist. My goal was simple but devastating. I needed to witness the theft of my life without becoming a part of the performance. I walked the remaining distance on foot, my rolling suitcase clicking rhythmically against the pavement. The sound felt like a countdown. When I reached the corner of my street, I stopped behind the thick trunk of an old oak tree. There it was, my sanctuary. A 2-story craftsman I had spent 5 years and $300,000 meticulously restoring. But it wasn't a sanctuary anymore. It was a construction site for a lie. A large, white moving van was backed into my driveway, its ramp resting heavily on the manicured lawn I had spent my weekends weeding. My mother, Martha, stood on the porch with a clipboard in one hand and a mug of my favorite artisanal coffee in the other. She was gesturing toward the second floor, pointing at the windows of my master suite as if she were a general commanding a battlefield. I watched as 2 men carried a massive, velvet-wrapped headboard through my front door. It wasn't mine. It was the ornate, expensive taste of a man who didn't have a nickel to his name. The sight of her standing there, using my home as a staging ground for Julian's latest delusion, sent a wave of icy fury through me. It wasn't the heat of a sudden temper. It was the deep, crushing cold of a glacier. I realized then that they hadn't just moved into my house. They had deleted me. In their minds, I was already gone, reduced to a line item in their budget that would continue to provide the setting for Julian's success. I pulled out my phone and checked the security feed again. From my vantage point behind the tree, I could see the physical reality, and on my screen, I could see the interior violation. My father, Silas, was in the kitchen, opening my pantry and tossing boxes of my expensive organic tea into a trash bag to make room for Julian's protein powders and energy drinks. They were erasing my scent, my taste, my very existence from the walls I owned. I didn't storm the porch. I didn't scream. That was the old Courtney, the one who would have rushed in to negotiate. To ask why, to beg for a compromise that would leave everyone happy but me. Instead, I turned around and walked back toward the main road. I had one stop to make before the trap could be sprung. 10 minutes later, I was sitting in the kitchen of my neighbor, Sarah. Sarah was a senior clerk at the county courthouse and a woman who understood the weight of a signed document. She pushed a plate of toast toward me, her eye scanning the printouts of the fraudulent car lease I had discovered on the plane. She didn't ask me if I was okay. She knew me well enough to know that being okay was a luxury I had traded for being prepared. Sarah leaned back, her face hardening into a mask of professional disgust. "This car lease is just the beginning, Courtney," she said, her voice low and steady. "If he used your social security number for a $90,000 vehicle." He didn't stop there. "People like Julian don't just take a mile, they take the whole map." She reached into a drawer and pulled out a manila folder she had prepared after I messaged her from the tarmac. She laid out the papers on the table. There were 3 more credit card applications, all using my name and her address as a secondary contact, because Julian had likely intercepted my mail months ago. There were utility accounts in Portland and a small business loan application for a digital media consulting firm that listed me as the guarantor. My brother hadn't just been living off my handouts. He had been building a second, shadow version of my financial life to act as his personal safety net. I felt the last thread of familial loyalty snap. It didn't make a sound, but the release of tension was staggering. I looked at the folder, then back toward the direction of my house. Sarah handed me a pen and a list of local numbers: the precinct, a private towing company, and a locksmith who specialized in high-security residential systems. "You have the title to the house," Sarah reminded me, her hand resting on mine. "You have the police report for the identity theft ready to be filed. And most importantly, you have the truth." "What do you want to do?" I stood up, the manila folder tucked firmly under my arm. I felt a strange, vibrating calm. I wasn't just an invisible daughter anymore. I was the person who held the deed to their reality. "I want to let him have his big moment," I said. "I want him to show the world exactly what he's built. And then I'm going to take the floor out from under him." I walked out of Sarah's house and back toward the street, where my moving van sat. The sun was fully up now, burning through the mist. The stage was set. The players were in position. And for the first time in my life, I was the one directing the scene. I went to a nearby hotel. Not to hide, but to work. I had a script to write, and Julian was about to have the performance of a lifetime. The hotel coffee shop was a sea of beige furniture and the low, constant hiss of an espresso machine. I sat in a corner booth. The manila folder from Sarah resting on the table, like a loaded weapon. Outside, the Seattle drizzle had turned into a steady downpour, blurring the world into shades of slate and charcoal. I opened my laptop, the screen reflecting in the dark lenses of my glasses. My goal for the next 2 hours was surgical. I needed to synchronize my counter, strike with Julian's public vanity. I navigated to Julian's Instagram profile. He had posted a countdown timer on his story. 3 hours and 42 minutes until the grand reveal. The caption was written in a font that looked like dripping gold. It read, "The beginning of a new empire. Stay tuned for the house tour you won't believe." I felt a cold, sharp twitch in my jaw. It was a tour of my blood, sweat, and 5 years of mortgage payments, rebranded as his personal empire. My brother, Julian, who had spent 10 years failing at every business venture I funded, was now using my house as his primary asset. I began to work. I wasn't just an architect of buildings today. I was an architect of consequences. I opened a drafting program and created a simple, high-contrast graphic. It was a by-side comparison of the numbers. On one side, I listed the total amount of money Julian had extracted from me over 60 months $84,312. On the other side, I listed his contributions $0.00. Below that, I attached a scanned copy of the fraudulent car lease agreement, highlighting the forged signature in a deep, undeniable red. As I worked, the waiter brought me a second cup of coffee. I didn't taste it. My mind was back in that hotel room in Chicago, hearing my mother say that I would just accept it. The memory didn't make me sad anymore. It acted as a fuel, a steady burn that kept my fingers moving across the keyboard. I was no longer the daughter who kept the peace. I was the auditor who demanded a settlement. I picked up my phone and made the first of 3 calls. The locksmith was a man named Gary, someone I had used when I first bought the house. "Gary, it's Courtney Miller," I said, my voice sounding like iron. "I need a full key and a deadbolt installation at 6:15 in the evening sharp. I will have the deed and my identification ready on the porch." He didn't ask questions. He knew the tone of a woman who was reclaiming her territory. The second call was to a private towing company. I gave them the make, model, and license plate of the luxury sport utility vehicle Julian had stolen in my name. I told them it would be parked in my driveway, and that I wanted it removed for unauthorized use. The dispatcher told me they could be there by 6:30 p.m. The third call was the hardest. I called my office. I told my partner that I was taking a personal leave for the rest of the week to handle a family emergency. For the first time in 10 years, I didn't apologize for being away. I didn't explain. I just stated the fact and hung up. The old Courtney would have felt a crushing guilt for leaving her team. The new Courtney realized that her team would survive, but she wouldn't if she didn't finish this. I spent the final hour scripting my entrance. Julian's live stream would be his peak moment of visibility. He would have his friends there, his followers watching, and my parents beaming in the background, like proud architects of a masterpiece they never touched. I wouldn't stop the stream. I would join it. I would provide the one thing Julian's brand could never survive: the truth. I looked at my watch. It was 4:45 p.m. The air in the coffee shop felt thick and charged, as if a storm were brewing inside the walls. I closed my laptop and tucked the folder into my bag. I felt a strange, vibrating stillness. There was no more anxiety, no more dread. I was simply a woman walking toward a foregone conclusion. I had spent my life making things easy for everyone else, ensuring that the people I loved never had to feel the weight of their own failures. I was done being a cushion. I was going to be the floor, and tonight, when they fell, they were going to find out exactly how hard I could be. I walked out into the rain, the cold water hitting my face like a benediction. It was time to go home. The 5:45 p.m. sky was the color of a fresh bruise. Dark purple and heavy with the promise of more rain. I pulled my car into a spot 3 houses down from my own, and sat in the darkness for a moment, listening to the rain tap against the roof. The sound was drowned out by a low, rhythmic thumping that I could feel in my floorboards. It was bass. My quiet, cedar, shingled sanctuary was vibrating with the sound of a party I hadn't authorized, in a life I no longer recognized. I stepped out of the car and walked toward my front door. The driveway was clogged with vehicles that didn't belong there, including the white sport utility vehicle Julian had stolen in my name. It sat there, gleaming under the streetlights. A $90,000 monument to his arrogance. I walked past it, my hand tightening on the strap of my bag. I felt a strange, cold detachment, as if I were an observer watching a film of my own life. I wasn't just a daughter coming home anymore. I was a landlord inspecting a ruin. I didn't use my key. The front door was slightly ajar. A final insult to the security I had always prized. As I stepped into the foyer, the smell hit me first. It wasn't the scent of my home. It was the smell of cheap cologne. expensive gin, and the metallic tang of electronics running too hot. My white oak floors were covered in muddy footprints. My minimalist living room had been gutted. My furniture, pieces I had saved for years to afford, was shoved into a corner like junk in a warehouse. In its place stood a maze of black metal tripods, ring lights that cast a harsh, artificial glow against the walls, and a massive velvet backdrop that looked like something out of a low-budget music video. A group of strangers, people in their 20s with bleached hair and restless eyes, sat on my sofa passing a bottle of gold-flecked vodka. They didn't even look up when I walked in. To them, I was just another guest, or perhaps a caterer they hadn't bothered to greet. Martha was at the center of the room. Her face, flushed with an energy I had only ever seen her give to Julian. She was directing two men who were trying to hang a neon sign over my fireplace. The sign said Julian's era in a flickering, aggressive pink. When she noticed me standing by the door, she didn't rush over to hug me. She didn't ask how my trip was. She froze, her expression shifting from excitement to a sharp, defensive annoyance. "Courtney, what are you doing here?" she snapped, her voice cutting through the bass. "I thought you were out of town until Friday. We are right in the middle of something important for your brother." "I came home," I said, my voice sounding eerily steady even to my own ears. "To my house." Martha sighed, the familiar, wary sound she used whenever I was being difficult. She stepped toward me, placing a hand on my arm as if to guide me out of the room. "Look, honey, Julian finally has a real chance here. He has sponsors coming on the stream tonight. We wanted to have everything perfect before you got back, so you wouldn't have to deal with the mess. Don't make this about you right now. Just go upstairs or find a hotel for the night. We will settle everything this weekend. Don't make this about me," I repeated. The words felt like lead in my mouth. I looked past her to the kitchen, where my father was opening a bottle of champagne for a girl I didn't recognize. I looked at the neon sign flickering over the hearth I had built with my own hands. The violation was so complete it was almost beautiful in its purity. They weren't even pretending anymore. Nearby, Julian emerged from my office, which was now filled with soundproofing foam and a glowing computer rig. He was wearing a silk shirt that probably cost as much as my monthly mortgage payment. He was holding his phone on a gimbal, his thumb hovering over the button that would link him to 50,000 people. He looked at me, and for a second, his smile flickered. He saw the folder in my hand. He saw the look in my eyes that he had never seen before. "Guys," he said into the camera, his voice shifting into a practiced, high-energy tone. "Look who decided to drop by. My sister, Courtney. Or, my sponsor, as you guys know her from my stories. She is the one who made all this possible. She is totally cool with the new setup. Say hi to the fans, Court." He swung the camera toward my face, the ring light blinding me for a split second. I didn't blink. I didn't move. I looked directly into the lens, seeing the little red tally light that indicated we were live. Thousands of strangers were watching my living room. Thousands of people were waiting for the invisible daughter to play her part. "No," I said, the word ringing out in the sudden silence, as someone turned down the music. "I am not cool with this. And I am definitely not your sponsor." Julian's smile tightened into a grimace of pure panic. "Relax," he muttered under his breath, though the microphone on his chest surely caught it. "You are ruining the vibe. We are live, Court. Don't do this." "I am not ruining the vibe, Julian," I said, stepping further into the light until I was the only thing the camera could see. "I am ending the illusion." I reached into my bag and pulled out the manila folder. The strangers on my couch finally stopped talking, their faces a mix of confusion and alarm. My father walked in from the kitchen, his face turning a deep, angry red. But I didn't look at them. I looked at the phone in Julian's hand. I looked at the audience he had built on my back. The trap was open. All I had to do was step back and let them fall in. The room felt cold, the air thin and charged with the scent of an impending storm. My heart was a slow, heavy beat. The scene they were so sure I would never make was finally beginning. The silence that followed my words was not empty. It was a pressurized thing. Thick with the scent of ozone and the sudden, frantic heat radiating from Julian. He stood there with the gimbal trembling in his hand. The small red light of the camera, acting like a laser sight on my chest. For a fleeting second, the old version of me, the invisible daughter who had been trained since birth to swallow her own tongue, felt a surge of pure, agonizing guilt. I saw my father's face contort into a mask of patriarchal fury, and my mother's eyes widen in a plea to return to my role as the silent backup plan. The pressure to be reasonable, to be the good one, was a physical weight pushing me toward the floor. But then I looked at the neon sign flickering over my fireplace, and the ghost of the girl I used to be finally vanished. I didn't flinch. I didn't lower my voice. I stepped closer to the lens. Ensuring that the thousands of people watching Julian's live stream could see every line of the document I held up. For everyone watching this, I said. My voice cutting through the room like a diamond on glass, I want to introduce myself properly. I am Courtney Miller. I am the sole owner of this house. I am the person who paid for the chair you are sitting on, the wine you are drinking, and the electricity powering this very stream. And as of this moment, every bit of this success you are witnessing is a lie built on $84,312 of my stolen life. Julian tried to laugh. But the sound was a jagged, desperate thing. Guys, she's clearly had a long flight, he said, his eyes darting to the comments scrolling up his screen. She's just stressed. Family joke, right? Courtney, put the paper down. You're embarrassing yourself. No, Julian, I replied, flipping to the next page in the folder. I am embarrassing you. Or rather, I am finally allowing you to face the reality you have been running from. This is a copy of a lease agreement for a $90,000 sport utility vehicle. It was signed 3 months ago using my social security number and a forged signature. I held the paper inches from the camera. I saw the red tally light blink, capturing the incriminating red ink I had used to highlight the forgery. The room had gone completely cold. The strangers on my sofa were no longer laughing. They were checking their own phones, watching the disaster unfold in high definition from 3 feet away. My father stepped forward, his boots heavy on my hardwood floors. This is a family matter, Courtney. Turn that damn thing off and go to your room. You are behaving like a child. You are destroying your brother's reputation in front of the whole world. I turned to him, and for the first time in 30 years, I didn't see a giant. I saw a man who had spent his life protecting a thief because it was easier than admitting he had failed as a parent. My brother's reputation is a fiction, Dad. And I am done being the ghostwriter. He didn't just steal from me. He stole from the future I worked for. He stole my name. And you and Mom sat in my living room and planned how to let him do it again. Martha reached out, her fingers digging into the sleeve of my blazer. Courtney, please. We did this for him. He just needed a win. Once he made it big, he was going to pay you back everything. We were going to tell you on Friday. We just wanted to surprise you with his success. A win? I asked, the word sounding hollow. You call identity theft a win. You call invading my home while I am 3,000 miles away a surprise. You didn't do this for him. You did this because you knew I was the only one who would pay the bill when he failed. Well, the bank is closed. Julian's gimbal finally dropped to his side. The camera was now pointing at the muddy floorboards, but the audio was still crisp, broadcasting his panic to his disappearing audience. You can't do this, he hissed. His face inches from mine. I have contracts. I have sponsors. If I lose this house today, I lose everything. I'll be ruined. I looked him in the eye, feeling a strange, clinical detachment. You aren't being ruined, Julian. You are being revealed. There is a difference. I walked to the nearest table and laid out the folder's contents like a map of a crime scene. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. The data was louder than any scream. I watched as my father's phone began to buzz in his pocket. Then my mother's. The world was starting to call back, and they weren't ready for the answers. This was the lowest point, the moment where the family I had spent my life protecting looked at me with genuine hatred. But as I stood in the center of my ruined living room, surrounded by lights that weren't mine and people who didn't love me, I realized that the ghost was gone. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was the only person in the room who wasn't afraid of the light. I checked my watch. It was 6:15 p.m. The front door, which had been left open by the people Julian invited, suddenly creaked wider. Sarah stepped in. I had messaged her from the car, and she was right on time. She was holding an envelope, and she wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking at my parents. The transition was beginning. The family squabble was about to become a legal reckoning, and for the first time, I wasn't the one who was going to have to fix it. Sarah stepped fully into the light. Her expression hard. She held the heavy manila envelope like a weapon. Julian went pale. He knew exactly who she was, and what her presence at my side meant. "I think this belongs here," Sarah said, her voice dropping into the room like a stone into a well. She didn't look at the camera. She didn't look at the fleeing guests. She walked straight to the mahogany table, where my records were already spread out like a flayed skin. She opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of documents. Official and dry, stamped with the seals of 3 different financial institutions. "This," she said, turning a page so my father could see it, "is a contract for a vehicle that Julian claimed was his. But the responsible party listed here is not Julian. It is Courtney. And these," she continued, laying out more papers, "are accounts opened in your names, Silas and Martha. Credit cards, personal loans. All of them opened over the last 18 months. All of them currently in arrears." My mother shook her head, her hand fluttering to her throat. "That is not possible," she whispered. "Julian wouldn't do that. He told us he was handling everything. He told us Courtney had approved the lines of credit to help him get started." "He lied, Martha," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. The truth was doing the screaming for me. I looked at my brother. He was backed against the velvet backdrop, the pink neon light of his era sign casting a sickly, artificial glow across his face. He looked small. For the first time in 30 years, he looked exactly like what he was, a thief who had run out of pockets to pick. My father's phone began to vibrate again, a frantic, buzzing sound that felt like a heart monitor flatlining. He pulled it from his pocket, his thumb trembling as he scrolled through a series of alerts that had clearly just been triggered by the public nature of the stream or the sudden movement on the accounts. He looked at the screen, then at the documents on the table, and finally at Julian. "You did this," Silas whispered. His voice wasn't angry anymore. It was broken. It was the sound of a man realizing the foundation he had built his pride on was made of sand. "You used her name. You used our names. You destroyed us to buy a car and a ring light." Julian didn't apologize. He didn't even have the grace to look ashamed. "It was just temporary," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I was going to make it right. Once the sponsorship money cleared, I was going to pay it all back. You all were supposed to be on my side. Courtney has everything. Why does she get to have it all while I have to beg for scraps?" I stepped forward, reclaiming the center of my home. "Because I worked for it. Julian. I built this life while you were busy figuring out how to steal it. You didn't want to win. You wanted a shortcut. And you used the people who loved you as the pavement." I looked at my parents. The betrayal on their faces was a mirror of what I had felt in that hotel room in Chicago. They were finally feeling the weight of the golden child they had cultivated. The consequences they assumed I would quietly absorb were now theirs to face. The identity theft, the ruined credit, the legal liability. It was all real. It was all theirs. The strangers in the room were gone now. Having slipped out through the side door, as soon as the word police was mentioned. The lights were still on, the camera was still rolling on the floor, capturing the feed of a family in ruins. I reached down and picked up Julian's phone. I looked into the lens one last time. "The show is over," I said to the 5,000 people still watching. And then I turned it off. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing against my eardrums. I took a deep breath, the air finally feeling clear of the cologne and the desperation. I turned to the locksmith, who was standing quietly in the foyer with his tools ready. "Change them all," I said. "Every door, every window." "Courtney," Martha sobbed, reaching out for me. "You can't just throw us out. We have nowhere to go. We are family." "You stopped treating me like family when you decided my life was a resource for you to exploit," I replied. I walked to the door and held it open. The rain was still falling, but the air smelled of wet earth and beginning. Everyone who does not live here needs to leave. Now, one by one, they walked past me. My brother with his head down. My father with his shoulders slumped. My mother still weeping for a dream that had never been real. I watched them go, not with hatred, but with a profound, liberating emptiness. The house didn't feel empty after they left. It felt quiet. For the first time in 30 years, the silence was mine to keep. I leaned against the kitchen counter, letting the weight of the day settle. Finally, I heard it. The mechanical click of the new deadbolt was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was sharp, final, and absolute. Gary the locksmith gave me a small, professional nod, handed me a heavy brass ring with 4 identical keys, and walked out into the night. I stood in the foyer, my back against the solid oak door. And listened to the rain. The rhythmic thumping of the bass was gone. The harsh, neon flicker of Julian's ambition had been unplugged. The air no longer smelled like strangers and stolen gin. It smelled like cedar and damp earth, and, for the first time in my life, honest to God peace. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. Instead, I walked through the house in the soft, gray shadows of the street lamps. I moved from room to room with a trash bag. My movements slow and deliberate. I pulled the neon pink sign from the fireplace mantel and dropped it into the plastic. I unclipped the ring lights from their tripods. I gathered the protein powders, the silk shirts left draped over my furniture, and the empty champagne bottles that marked the site of my attempted erasure. Each item I removed felt like a splinter being pulled from my skin. I found my favorite armchair, pushed into a dark corner of the laundry room. It took me 10 minutes of straining and sweating to move it back to its place by the bay window, but the physical effort felt like a cleansing. When I finally sat down, the fabric felt familiar against my palms. This was my chair. This was my house. I was no longer the invisible daughter waiting for permission to exist. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a wall of text from my mother. She told me that Julian was devastated, that my father's blood pressure was dangerously high, and that I had destroyed the family's reputation over a few dollars and a misunderstanding. She said that family problems were meant to be kept private, and that by exposing them, I had proven I was the cold, unfeeling person they always feared I would become. I read the words and felt a strange, quiet thrill of relief. For 30 years, a message like that would have sent me into a spiral of panic and apology. I would have been on the phone within seconds, trying to fix the unfixable, trying to earn back the love of people who only valued me as a safety net. But as I sat in the darkness, I realized that the coldness she described was actually just the absence of their fire. I wasn't unfeeling. I was just no longer willing to be the fuel. I deleted the thread and blocked the numbers. It wasn't an act of cruelty. It was an act of survival. I had spent my life building structures for everyone else, ensuring that they never had to feel the weight of the sky. I had finally learned that if you spend all your time being a pillar for others, you eventually forget how to stand on your own. I looked out the window at the quiet Seattle street. The white sport utility vehicle was gone, towed to a lot, where it would sit until the legal system decided its fate. Julian was gone, stripped of his audience and his stolen credit. My parents were gone. I forced to finally look at the sun they had created without the buffer of my bank account to soften the view. I walked into the kitchen and made a pot of tea. The simple, domestic act felt like a ritual. I sat at the mahogany table, the same table where Julian had dropped his cardboard boxes, just 48 hours ago. And I watched the steam rise in the moonlight. The silence didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like the first breath I had taken in 30 years. I had been the stable one, the reasonable one, and the fixer. I had been the ghostwriter of my brother's life, and the silent partner in my parents' denial. But tonight, that version of Courtney Miller was buried under the weight of the truth. I was an architect of my own life now, and the foundation was finally solid. I closed my eyes and let the quiet settle into my bones. My home was calm, and for the first time, so was I. The house didn't feel empty. It felt full of me. This was the end of the scene they expected, and the beginning of the life I chose.